Start over. Thank you everyone for attending our book reading today. This is for our anti-racist community engagement principles and practices, section 3. My name is Cindy Vincent. I'm an associate professor of media and communication at Salem State University and one of the co-editors of the volume. And I'm going to pass the mic to Aldo and then to Brooke, and you guys can introduce yourselves.
Good afternoon, everyone. So glad to see you here. I'm glad you could make it. My name is Aldo Garcia Guevara, and professor of history and political science at Worcester State University, chair of interdisciplinary studies, and one of the co-editors and one of the authors in the book. And Brooke.
Hi, everyone. I'm Brooke Covington. I'm an assistant professor of English at Christopher Newport University. I'm also the academic director of our Center for Community Engagement, along with a sprinkling of other administrative roles at the university. But I'm really happy to be here. I know Cam is trying to get into the room, but Cameron Bertrand will be joining us. And he is the CEO of a local nonprofit here in Newport News in the Hampton Roads region in Norfolk. Called Violence Intervention and Prevention, and I'm trying to help him get in the room, so stay tuned.
Great. You helped Cam. That's much more important. I'll go ahead and continue with our introduction. So I'm going to share my screen real quick and just give you guys a brief overview of our book if you're not super familiar with it. So our co-edited volume on anti-racist community engagement came out just this last fall. And we encourage everyone, if you have not been able to get a copy of it yet, it's still available through Stylus and Campus Compact. We want to thank Campus Compact for hosting today's session and helping us to spread the word about it. And I just want to give you guys a brief overview of the book. So it's this work came together through a collaborative called the New England Equity and Engagement Consortium, based out of New England region, primarily Massachusetts. One of our co-editors is even with us today. Thank you, John, for joining us. And the book itself was based off of a couple of grants that we had received to look into how we are leveraging the cultural wealth of our students of color and our community partners of color, and how we're embedding those within our pedagogical practices, particularly our community engaged practices, to ensure that we're centering anti-racism in our community engaged practices. Prior to this point, quite often we would see anti-racist pedagogy over here, community engaged pedagogy over there. And this book is really trying to intertwine these together to say they're not two separate things, right? That when we're doing really good, really thoughtful and mindful community engagement, that we're centering anti-racism right in the nexus there. So the book itself is broken out into several sections based on 4 main principles that we've compiled on anti-racist community engagement. And the first principle is focuses on counteracting the persistence and impact of racism on our campuses and in our community engagement. The second principle focuses on critical reflection on individual and systemic structural racism. And today's section particularly, so Aldo and I were the co-editors for this section, we're focusing today on intentional learning and course design, developing anti-racist learning goals, course content, policies, and assessment. And we're lucky to have Brooke Covington and Cameron Bertrand here with us today to talk about centering Counterstories and Anti-Racist Podcasting Pedagogies. And then the 4th section of our book focuses on compassionate and reflective classrooms. I also just wanted to give a quick shout out to our blog series that we had over last summer. So if the book isn't enough and these webinar or these meetings aren't enough, we also had a blog series over the last summer. So you can engage further with the authors of our book and some of the information that they provide in the book. Further here, a lot of these blogs talk about updates since the book, what's been happening in their anti-racist community engaged work. So that's also a great resource too. And I'll drop all these links in the chat as well. So that's a little bit about our book. Thank you everyone for joining us today. Am I forgetting anything, Aldo? I think that's it, right?
I think that's good.
Okay. Are we still waiting on Cam, Brooke?
We are, but I've sent him the link. I think he's troubleshooting, and I want to be mindful of everyone's time, so I don't mind taking us through some of the slides, and then Cam can introduce himself when he comes in. just because I know we're on a schedule. I'm going to share a direct link to the slides for everyone. And I'll go ahead and share my screen, but feel free to follow along in whichever format you prefer. All right, let me move this because it's all cluttered. Okay. I'm gonna make myself tiny. All right. Thank you so much, Cindy and Aldo, for that introduction and for working with us throughout this journey. We both really appreciate all of your labor on this collection. So how to be an anti-racist podcaster. I'm Brooke Covington. Cameron Bertrand is going to be joining us momentarily. I wanted to give a brief kind of overview of what we're going to talk about, and it's really going to mirror our chapter. So we'll give a brief introduction to who we are. We'll talk a little bit about our case and Christopher Newport University in particular, and Newport News. Then we'll talk a little bit about our anti-racist podcasting practices, and then we'll talk about the larger connections. Oh, Cam's in the waiting room.
I just let Cameron in, so.
Okay, perfect. Right on time. Okay, so that's kind of a breakdown for what we're going to talk about. And we'll start with introductions especially now that Cam's here, that will make this much easier. So I'm Brooke Covington. I'm at Christopher Newport University, which is located in Newport News, Virginia, in southeastern Virginia, in the Tidewater region. I'm an assistant professor of English, and I'm also the academic director of the Center for Community Engagement. And then Cam, I hate to put you on the spot right when you can catch your breath and get in the room, but do you want to introduce yourself a little bit?
Absolutely. I thrive on the spot. Luckily for us, we're here. I had to switch over to my cellular device, so I appreciate everybody's patience with this technology these days. My name is Cameron Bertrand. I see some familiar faces up here. I see my guy John and Aldo up here. A few more people. I am the CEO and founder of Violence Intervention and Prevention, VIP LLC. I'm also the founder of Buyback the Block, Beyond the Bullet, and the Gun Violence Intervention and Prevention Outreach and Research Center. So I've had the honor and privilege of working alongside of some amazing scholars and researchers such as Brooke to be able to be instrumental in the qualitative approaches that we do take in our community to prioritize trauma-informed, evidence-based, outcome-driven solutions in our communities. So as a CNU alum and partner of the university, I'm always honored to create opportunities to share platforms and to make sure we're uplifting spaces for the amazing research that we're doing to make sure it connects with boots on ground work.
Absolutely. Thanks, Cam. I'm so glad. I was very nervous about having to run this alone. So I'm so glad you're here, even if it's on your cell phone. So I thought we might start with just the way that the chapter starts. So these are the first two sentences of the chapter, and we'll round out the presentation with the last two sentences of the chapter. So kind of entice you all to maybe go check out this really, really powerful edited collection. So this chapter presents podcasting as a means to intertwine anti-racist principles with mindful community engagement. So just like what Cindy was saying in her opening, rather than keeping those things separate, really bringing them into conversation with each other. Specifically, we describe the creation of a community-based podcast called the Tidewater Project and advocate for podcasting as a form of anti-racist community engagement that diversifies course content, decenters whiteness, integrates the voices of marginalized communities, and values community-based forms of knowledge. So that's kind of a brief snapshot of what our chapter gets up to. And we'll tell you a little bit more about this podcast that comes from Newport News, Virginia. This is kind of the opening blurb on the podcast. And I do want to jet forward to the next two slides in case you all want to check it out for yourselves. So there's a QR code there if you want to listen on your desktop, or if you'd prefer to listen on your smartphone, there's a QR code to the podcast. There you can listen to the episode that features Cam and his story, as well as lots of other examples from the students who have worked on this over the past 2 times that this course has run. Yeah, so now we'll turn it over and talk a little bit about the case that we are kind of looking at. So really thinking about Christopher Newport University and Newport News. A little bit of history about CNU before I turn it over to Cam to talk about demographics. So Christopher Newport University started off initially in 1960 as Christopher Newport College. It was a branch college of William and Mary, and they lacked a physical campus. So while searching for a place to put this branch college, city officials targeted what's known as the Shoe Lane community, which was a thriving African-American community that was about 60 acres. Shoe Lane residents fought for over 2 years to keep their land, but eventually city officials seized their land through quote unquote condemnation, very similar to redlining tactics that were used around this time period, and paid 20% below market prices for these homes. And so that's kind of the troubling history of CNU. And maybe Cam can talk a little bit about the racial makeup at CNU, particularly from his perspective as an alumni or an alumnus of the university. So I'll turn it over to Cam. We have statistics about both CNU and Newport News.
Yeah, so very important to note is that the bubble that CNU was able to successfully create does not reflect the surrounding community as a whole when we talk about the demographics of Newport News. So with Newport News having such a large population of Black people in our community, we don't see the equity and the access to resources that trickle out into the surrounding community. So a lot of people, myself included, when I was able to attend Christopher Newport University, I quickly learned that a lot of people who were coming to this institution were not aware of the surrounding issues, whether it came to gun violence or the poverty level, homelessness, and different things that impact Newport News as a whole, even when you talk about environmental sustainability. So when you talk about even the amount of students, the numbers we included, of course, in our study, but the amount of students that come into Christopher Newport University, Black students in particular, does not reflect the recidivism rate either. So when you talk about this big initiative to be able to bring students in through different programs like community captains and different things, that initiatives that were birthed in hindsight, to be intentional for exactly what we're talking about, but without addressing the history and the trauma that also created displacement to go with it. So that was something for me, being a Black student at a predominantly white institution. I learned very quickly that without the storytelling aspect that not only created through podcasts and platforms such as ours, but the actual need for equitable representatives and resources within our institution, so that we can have voices coming from people who have been impacted by the displacement, for people that would be able to utilize their knowledge as a qualitative or quantitative researcher to connect the dots to the families that were displaced and figuring out what is the correct way to address some of the trauma that we have made created within that institution. So even me being a Black male, I am not an exception to anything that CNU has taken part of as far as the ripple effect this has created throughout the city. Because if I don't do anything about it with that given knowledge, then I am just as much a part of the problem. So when given the opportunity to be a part of this podcast, it wasn't just to come in and tell my story as a gun violence survivor and woe was me. It was a call to action to make sure that people understood that there are many barriers that created an environment for gun violence, the same environment which is very, very much so present in not only Newport News, but many, probably the same communities that you all reside in. So figuring out how can we take these solutions and hearing the testimonies and figure out to prioritize the resources and areas that are being impacted primarily by some of the issues that we've combated. So without that given knowledge, I think that we can all say as members of our institutions and researchers in a whole that we have been able to obtain a certain level of knowledge and wisdom based on our level of education. And without that level of education, I don't think that we would have the correct means to address some of the issues. So I do want to make sure that even as people go out and are able to adopt this book and the principles and practices, that we are addressing our own personal biases, because without that, it may skew some of the information that we're even digesting.
Yeah, thanks for that, Cam. That's really helpful to provide the context for this work that, you know, we did with the podcast, but continue to, you know, try to amplify and act in the community. So one of those pieces, I teach a course called IDST 250. It's an Intro to Civic Engagement and Social Justice course. For the educators in the room, who want to know the logistics of the course, how big is it, where is it on the curriculum? The course is capped at 19 students. It's listed as an interdisciplinary studies course, so it's open to all students at the university. There are no prereqs on this class, and it is a required course for our Bonner Service Scholars. So getting into a little bit of the practice of, you know, what does anti-racist podcasting practice look like? In this class, one of our big assignments, really the final assignment that we work on over the course of 6 to 8 weeks, is a community-based podcast, the Tidewater Project. So this is a brief kind of assignment description. The students have to publish a 15 to 20 or more minute podcast on a topic relative to the Hampton Roads community. They have to include at least 3 references to materials that we've read or discussed in class. And they also have to incorporate the voice, the perspectives of at least one community member in the podcast episode. So here are kind of the logistics of that. Students are placed in teams of about 3 to 4 students, and then they often have at least one, if not multiple, community partners that they're working with to try to tap into that community-based grassroots expertise. The assignment is really scaffolded to begin with a group contract, where the students come up with a contract on how they like to work together, how they'll address conflict, how they'll divide the workload, those kinds of things. They submit an episode proposal to me for feedback, and I help them identify potential community partners that they could work with in collaboration with the Center for Community Engagement. Then they do an interview protocol assignment where they try to come up with interview questions. They share those with the community partner, get feedback on them. They share them with me and get feedback on them. And all of this is working towards the eventual MP3 of the episode with associated cover art, notes, and a full episode transcription so that this is accessible to all kinds of listeners. And then they do a self and a group performance evaluation. They evaluate themselves and they evaluate their group and how well they feel they performed in this assignment. Some of the big anti-racist podcasting strategies that we try to elevate and champion both in the classroom and in the chapter is critical race theory's notion of counter storytelling, which we can talk more about in the Q&A if you'd like. I just plopped in 2 quotes from leading experts on these areas. Asia Martinez explains that the formation of counter stories, through the formation of counter stories, voices from the margins become the voices of authority in the researching and relating of BIPOC experiences. So in our society, there are dominant narratives, right? Stock narratives about, you know, in Cam's case, he can talk about the dominant narratives about those who are, you know, either survivors of gun violence or perpetrators of gun violence. And then there are those counter stories, right? The counter representations of what those stereotypes are that kind of speak truth to power from a legitimate and valid place. Then there's what's known as radical listening. This comes from civil rights leader Ella Baker. Patricia Parker published a book on her catalytic leadership in 2020, and she talks a lot about Ella Baker's valuing of radical listening, right? That radical listening begins with perspective taking, and it involves being intentional about co-action. And then importantly, which this is something we talk with the students about a lot, is listening for silences, right? So listening to how silence can inform social justice work. So those are two big strategies that we kind of really lean into in this podcast. But we recognize, and Cam and I talk a lot about this, Cam's already spoken about this, even in just talking about the context, that we recognize that there's a risk of colonizing these narratives, right? And so, especially given the edited nature of podcasts, right? That podcasts are an edited form of storytelling, at least in most cases. I know there are those podcasts that go on for 4 hours that aren't really heavily edited, but these are edited stories. And so to mitigate that risk, we really try to adopt principles of a trauma-informed approach. Cam, I don't know if you want to maybe speak to, if you feel comfortable to speak to your experiences with adopting a trauma-informed approach, or your experiences sharing your story on the podcast.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the aspect in which the podcast itself was introduced, being intentional. So knowing that without that, we are asking people to share their stories in a capacity where you're reliving a trauma that may not be easy for you to tell, right? No matter how beneficial or how helpful it may be for the next person. So in given that regard, approaching that in an intentional aspect, being trauma informed for everybody on this call is something that is mandatory. It is important for us to come from a sense of understanding that we may never understand the trauma that our peers are experiencing. It does not excuse us from the need for empathy and understanding. So in that regard, we learn through that interaction, and we're able to take trauma-informed approaches even down to the way that we talk and the way that we have to tell our stories, and not being adopted. You'll see in our chapter where standard academic English was spoken about. And so without having to code switch, and without having to change my vernacular, and without having to change how I talk and what I say and what was said to me in an interaction, things like that made it feel like not only a free, but a safe space. When you talk about the power of storytelling, it is important for everybody to realize that whatever story we're trying to tell, will this be one that can help amplify not only the voices for people who may not ever share their stories, but can we make this a teachable moment to not repeat history, to not repeat the trauma, not repeat the cycles of violence and racism? Because the first step of that is making sure that we are, again, addressing those personal biases. Without that conversation, it is hard to feel any middle ground. So being trauma informed in that aspect was really important, and it is important with the research that we're doing, and not holding people to the standards that are built within the social constructs of our nation and our government. So I think that was important for me to be able to come into that space and feel comfortable enough to share my story in a way that is not only compelling, but that is true, that is raw, that is righteous, but is also teachable for those who may have a certain narrative that is attached to a certain stigma that comes with violence and trauma in the Black community.
Yeah, thanks for that, Cam. That's so helpful. And you've touched on some of the things, right, that all of these connections that, emerge from podcasting and linguistic diversity and cultural wealth of spoken language. And so, 3 of the things that Cam and I, during this time, it was, long chats on the phone, driving home from work, Cam trying to navigate getting across the water. If any of you all have ever taken the HRBT, you know that it's a nightmare. But that we really want to emphasize anti-racist co-creation, that students and community partners are positioned as co-creators of the episode. We also want to prioritize and value anti-racist assessment. So students and community partners co-creating the podcasting rubric, like what counts as, as a good podcast episode, or what we think makes for what we want to assess as knowledge sharing and creation. And then we also wanted to prioritize and promote anti-racist agency, that community partners have ultimate say over whether the episode is published. And if they decide later, actually, I don't want this published, that we agree to take it down. And so those were, 3 big areas for us. And Cam was already touching on some of the connections that we talk about in this chapter. So to Cam's point, celebrating linguistic diversity, that Cam could come and tell his story how he wanted to tell it, using whatever vernacular felt safe and comfortable for him, valuing that anti-racist form of assessment. And then, Cam and I were literally just talking about this before the call started, but we really want to amplify and validate creative truth-telling, to situate storytelling and radical listening as valid research methodologies. And I know Cam's been thinking hard about that.
Yeah, I mean, it's imperative at this level, and the approaches that we take to that can actually be the safe haven, because I think that in times we've even seen that lack of intention with, as researchers, we can get so focused on the data and extracting the data and getting the outcomes, but forget about the fact that there's a real people attached to real numbers. Whether before it was quantitative, it was a qualitative. Before it was qualitative, it was somebody's story. It was something that they experienced, that they lived. And so without that intention, we become culture vultures. Culture vultures. I don't know if anybody ever heard that concept, but what we don't want to do is come in and exploit and extract data and leave and not do anything with it. I've done this work in over 12 states now, and my background in anthropology has helped tremendously, because I know for a fact that I can't go into any area and just extract data, no matter how much I'm helping, no matter how good my intentions are, without leaving them with something. So even with the students that were a part of this, they were able to present this podcast at a national social justice conference. They were able to work with a real organization doing real work with real people. Like, Brooke didn't just check off a box and say, hey, this is a class, it sounds good, it's great for the university accreditation. Could have did that and kept it pushing. But to make sure that they were connected with real people, real stories, and those students were able to volunteer with my organizations after this and able to share these stories, that's what it's about, y'all. We're going to have opportunities to check boxes. We're going to have opportunities to shatter those same boxes. But it's ultimately up to us. So I think that even this book being a blueprint, this chapter being a call to action, but the work that you all are doing each day is the key to everything that we need to see moving forward.
Yeah, that Cam was a part of the social justice conference, and that the students were able, I think a lot about, and Cam and I talk a lot about the auxiliary learning objectives for a project like this one. And more as I'm engaging with students in more community-based teaching and learning, I think a lot about these auxiliary learning objectives, that Cam is trying to teach students to not be culture vultures, to think about the people behind the numbers, and to also think about storytelling as a valid form of research, that you could take something like a podcast and share it at larger venues as a valid form of sharing knowledge and generating knowledge and developing knowledge in whatever spoken language feels comfortable to you. So yeah, there are some limits to this approach, though. We do recognize that, especially when the podcast itself is embedded in a course like this one. We've been thinking about different ways to get the podcast out of a course, to bring it into a more intentional space, because there are lots of constraints here, right? So thinking about invention and the generating of episode topics, a lot of that happens from the student perspective, with little interaction between community partners, at least at that early stage. And that's a tricky question for Cam and I. When do those relationships begin? Does it begin before this course even starts? Should it begin before the course starts? How do we come up with episode topics in a way that's responsive, but also demonstrating that ethic of care and taking a trauma-informed approach? We also realize that it's really difficult to cultivate intentional and sustainable relationships and trust in 15 weeks, right? So in the time of a semester, that is extremely difficult, maybe even not possible. And that gets into the next one, right? Time, that engaging over a 15-week semester is limited, right? And then also that reciprocity approach to ensure that both parties are benefiting, that both parties feel, that this is something that's been good for both of them, right? So we realize that there are limits, but I'll end with the last two sentences of our chapter, right? And so even with these limitations, we still believe that podcasts quite literally create space to microphone the margins in ways that highlight and challenge racially driven disenfranchisement. We thus argue for the transformative power of podcasting as a tool for promoting and practicing anti-racist community engagement within and beyond the institutions of higher education. So that's kind of what we'll leave you with. We're also both happy to talk more. Cam and I really wanted to leave time to talk with you all. So we're happy to talk about logistics, questions you might have about the theoretical orientation of this work, more about Cam's episode and what he was able to do with the students. And if you're interested, there's our email addresses if you'd like to contact us, maybe outside of the recorded, video setting. We also list references in here if anybody wants to check those out. I put the link to the slides in the chat.
Yes, don't be shy. Ask questions.
Indeed, Cam and Brett, thank you so much for all of that. I'll say maybe just a couple of things and start us off with a question, and then we can open it up to everyone else. I really loved both in the chapter and of course your project, just the centering the co-creation of knowledge, right, which is so important, right, the creative truth telling, and being cautious, right, and understanding the limits, right, and thinking about, and maybe you can address some of that in terms of what actions you're taking moving forward in terms of thinking about this. But I was also curious, Cam, you had mentioned, right, that ultimately this is a call to action, and so maybe you can elaborate a little further as to what is the action that's coming out of this and some examples of that.
Yeah, so I think that in a general sense, the call to action is that we do understand at this point, although we probably should have already, that gun violence is absolutely a public health crisis. And it is something that is impacting everybody. The definition of something that impacts or to be defined and as a public health crisis is that it not only impacts the livelihood of our citizens, but it's impacting our economy. So when you talk about the amount of money that our government spends on the aftermath of gun violence, you're talking about well over $50 million a day. And when you talk about that, we talk about the aspect that there could be so much more funding put into prevention than actually the afterthought, right? And that would result in the lives still being here and people being able to still benefit from that investment. We're talking about getting a return on investment from our government, because now we're asking them, can you please take the money that you're spending on death and actually invest in the lives of people to help keep them here? The call to action for us is that as researchers, there's a gap that we can fill. Somehow, some way, in 1996, our government was allowed to create a Dickey Amendment. If you've never heard of it, please look it up. I believe that this is one of many issues that our nation faces right now. But the fact that there was an amendment that was created that prohibited researchers from getting funding for gun violence, to research gun violence, to research the impact of gun violence that existed for 20 years, y'all. What that did was create a gap in our country that I can argue can be placed to blame on our government. So when you talk about a call to action, you talk about the fact that if the CDC was not allowed to do research in 2020 around COVID, where would we be right now? It's unheard of. So when you talk about stopping the spread, that was the call to action in 2020. So with the aspect of gun violence, if we talk about the spread of violent interactions and we talk about how trauma spreads through interaction, nobody is born violent. This is learned behavior. So in that regard, I believe that we can actually undo the behavior if we can outweigh negative experiences with positive ones. So my ability to be able to come in and do a storytelling in that regard was able to help with not only amplifying the voices and the messages, but the ideas that I've gained from going through something like this and being able to come from a peer support environment, but also being able to share this platform with others who may feel like they have a story to tell as well. And what it does is creates an outlet, it creates a sense of hope for people who may not have experienced that. So rooting that back to now the social constructs that we live in, the call to action for us all is to make sure that we're unrooting what has been socially accepted for far too long. That's the truth, that there are many things that are rooted in our nation, in our country right now that should not have been. And they go from the Constitution down. So we have to not only argue, but provide the means and educate others and provide the materials and to spread our knowledge and to spread this information to people who may not have the level of education to go out and argue and fight for themselves. We're not asking people to come in and be saviors, but to create a nation that is just and equitable, we have to put people in positions to not only help themselves, but to help the people around them. And that's the call to action to everybody. Nobody is above or beneath that.
The only other thing I'll say about call to action is I think a lot of our young people are feeling particularly disenfranchised and disempowered by our politics right now. And I think we've got to think hard about how to get them engaged. And I think, both Cam and I believe that getting students involved, grassroots, boots on the ground, you might be screaming into the void when it comes to federal politics, but your state and local politics, you can actually, less so scream into the void, and students can feel like they actually know the people that are representing them and have access to them. And so a big call to action that I've been thinking of since writing this chapter is how do we help empower young people to know that it is still possible to make a change, even though it feels like it's not.
Yeah. And I think that is, again, the work that we all are doing. Can we actually help connect people to best practices in our community? Can we actually help connect people to trauma-informed, evidence-based, outcome-driven solutions that yield equitable results and affirmative action in our legislation, in our policies? Like, can we create a system that works in our favor, in an equitable favor, no matter who's in it? That's what we need, right? People say the system is broken, but it's doing what it was designed to do. So we don't just need to reform some things got to go all together. And that's just the truth. As an abolitionist, I believe there's certain things that cannot be reformed. But I do believe that if we have the evidence, if we can actually take what has been done and be able to look at those things, then we can actually ask young people, hey, what do you think about this? And how can we do this differently? So those all are not only call to actions, but they're separate, they're unique, and they're all important in their own aspects. When I was able to go to the conference to meet some of my, fellow co-authors, not just from this chapter, but just from this book as a whole, I learned, or was reminded, I should say very quickly, that we all have different things that we're fighting against. We all have different angles that we're actually trying to learn. How do we get to a place where our nation feels like it's one that my young people can walk down the block and feel like I belong here, whether I'm on my block, in my hood, or I'm down the street in a community that looks nicer than mine? How can I go out into a place, and we're talking about things that there's people on this call you won't even be able to change. I can't change, nobody in this call could change the fact that when I walk out of this door, if I'm not dressed in a suit, that I have to walk a certain way to look less aggressive. I have to talk a certain way to sound more educated. These are the things that nobody in this call can be able to change. So how can you actually leave roots to change that for the next generation? That's the call to action within itself. Because if I could do it myself, I would, trust me. But these are things that, again, with those lived experiences that others have, like that is how I learned what allies are. That's what I learned what family is like, not the ones you're just born with. We all literally have a call to action because these principles and practices is only half the step. If that, there are going to be things and people who do not understand or can't fathom the changes that we're demanding of our community. So I think that the more stories that we capture, the better chance we have of somebody identifying with at least one of them. That's all it takes. They may not identify with my story or yours, but if we can capture as many as possible to make sure that they identify with somebody, that's all we need. That's really all we need. And that's why I'm thankful for not only people in this call, but for people like Brooke who get it, who understand what this good fight is about, who understand that we all are standing up against something right now. It's not about Black or white. It's about everybody against systemic racism, everybody against social injustice. Because without that, none of us will actually be able to live in a happy and just world. That's just the truth, no matter how we try to alienate the problem.
Other questions?
I saw people messaging me. I was trying to stay on my soapbox and read at the same time. I was failing though. But yeah, I'll try to go through these. I think I answered that one already.
Looks like
Okay,
John
good.
has his hand up.
John is the man, y'all. I need y'all to know. We was in New Orleans together. That's the man. He's a party animal, man. He had me up at the casinos all night and stuff. I'm just playing. He didn't. But
Yeah. Tim. Partying is certainly part of it. I don't want to be part of a revolution where you can't also party. So
come on, good trouble. That's what I let it hear.
yeah. So I have a question, Brooke, for you. I was starting to write it in the chat, but you were teaching a course that seems like it's just an ideal home for this kind of podcasting project. It's an interdisciplinary course. You can pull on all kinds of different disciplinary knowledge. It's a course on social justice and community engagement. So it's like, a perfect storm for a good outcome. But what I'm wondering is, because you've done this work, how broadly do you see this kind of social justice podcasting fitting into the curriculum across the rest of the campus? And, where is it that people in other disciplines might also be able to do similar kinds of things to what you and Cam have done?
Yeah, that's such a good question. I mean, it really is, I'm lucky I have this shell course that I can really kind of tailor to whatever the podcast becomes. And the chapter even speaks a bit about like adapting those last 8 weeks to what we need to learn in order to understand the issues that the students are looking at. And so not many courses are that flexible. And that might be a commentary actually on our curriculum and problems with the way that we think about curriculum. However, I think if this were to be instituted across the curriculum or more, like hot spots or touchstones in the curriculum, that's one avenue, and I'll talk about that. But we also have something called, we have the Center for Community Engagement at CNU. We also have the Center for Civic Leadership. And I'm noticing that academic centers are also starting to tap into podcasting as a useful kind of tool to help get the word out. I think too often podcasts in university settings are just used to like highlight and amplify what faculty are doing, which I just think, no offense to anybody who does that work, I think that's great and good, but we could also use podcasts to do more revolutionary stuff, that like faculty have lots of avenues to publish their work and to get their work out, but those opportunities are are fewer, I think, for some of our community partners, some of our community experts, some of our community-based activists. And so I think that we should be thinking about podcasting in this more expansive way, not just to, you know, highlight the work that faculty or students are doing, but that it can be all of us, you know. In terms of thinking about it across the curriculum, I've thought a lot about, at CNU we have a writing intensive designator, and each student has to take at least 2 writing intensive courses in their tenure at CNU. And so I've been thinking a lot about what if we approached the training for those writing intensive courses, because faculty who teach WIs have to go through training. If we presented podcasting as another writing intensive genre, though it doesn't look like writing like this, you know, which I printed off my chapter, but I also have the hard copy, I promise, but I'm a hard copy person. I know I'm terrible. But you know, that podcasting involves a good bit of writing. I'm an English professor. My PhD is in writing and rhetoric. And so, you know, that podcasting are actually just a genre to amplify oral storytelling, you know, and sometimes it's oral storytelling, sometimes it's written and prepared testimony, right? And so, you know, I think that there are ways of injecting podcasting as a genre to do whatever community-based work you're doing with your classes. So if you can imagine your course having any facet that's community-based, instead of having the students do something like writing up a report and submitting it for assessment, why not ask them to create a podcast episode that captures the work they're doing with their community partners? And that could happen in a chemistry course, right? Like, we partnered with this agency to study water samples, or I don't know what chemists do, you know, but it could go across different disciplines if we just thought more intentionally about community-based teaching and learning, and then how we make that experience legible to other audiences. You know, that we prioritize, Cam mentioned it, we prioritize standard academic English at the university, but why? You know, and also, why do students need to demonstrate their knowledge on a piece of paper that they're submitting to a learning management system? That it can be different. So yeah, I don't know if that answers your question or if I just rambled on and jumped on my soapbox, but I'll hop down.
I think that was a great answer to my question. Thanks for that.
We have a question in the chat. It says, I find that students feel overwhelmed right now with national and global politics. How do we empower students to, instead of getting lost in the politics and rhetoric, show them they can make meaningful change with grassroots organizations and tell that story in a meaningful way that does not incite culture vultures or a narrative that further places the communities they work in as othered, with placing the community at the forefront of their narratives?
Yeah. I ran for office in 2020. So that was my biggest step for to answer to that question. I was like, shit. It's one of those things you like, you know, can you really blame people until you try it yourself? You know what I mean? And it was a bit of that, but also I remember as an undergraduate student, that was 10 years ago, y'all. I know I look young. All right, I'm 33, so that was quite a bit ago. But when I was sitting in undergrad and I learned about political hegemony, I was like, huh. So as a reminder, you know, political hegemony is essentially when we have people in position where they're actually making laws and policies, and they're not even in the risk of consequences for violating these laws, right? Like, they're very ethnocentric in their thinking. Do they actually care? And so with that, we have to also remind young people that, hey, I'm with you, I agree, but none of this will change unless we put people in positions to do something about it, right? Every year I go to the General Assembly and I bring 40 to 50 kids up there. Like, at this point, I'm gonna do whatever I gotta do to make this cool. Like, they're gonna believe at some point that this is the coolest thing ever, but they have to see themselves in those solutions. Representation is huge. Identity is huge because, again, let's be honest, there is no affirmative action when it comes to most of the legislation in our communities, and they're not equitable. So even if it's just one person, a representative that they can identify with, that's where it starts. If not, that's where it ends, because they have to see themselves in these policy legislation. They have to see themselves in the people doing this work. After that, I was able to not only speak interest, but making sure that I learned where it is that I can actually funnel people's energy into tangible change. Like learning where it is that we need to go for the correct issues. If we send a child or a youth or even adult to go talk to city council about something that the congressman is responsible for, then we're setting them up for failure, right? Like, how can they actually get involved in something that doesn't work? So giving people hope is also giving people a fighting chance and making them realize, like, this is where we need to focus our energy. What is it that you care about? Because I don't care what it is, whatever it is, there's somewhere, some down the line, your government or policy legislation is involved in this, whether it's governing it or funding it in one way or another. So finding out what people care about and what has impacted them the most and bringing them to those means, that's been the most important thing. And starting small, because without that, most people don't have an outright desire in politics. I definitely don't. But I do have a desire in being a part of solutions and being a part of change. And I was like, at this point, I'll do whatever I have to do. I was a paralegal in the Army, so I studied the law for a long time, which is why I never wanted to get in politics. I said, heck no. But at the same time, I do have a good enough grasp to understand that I want to be a legislative leader. I don't want to be a politician. But I think that we need a lot of legislative leaders, people who are compassionate, who are empathetic, who have been through lived experiences that can actually pull from lived experience, not from something that they saw or read in a book. And I think that is the biggest thing for getting young people not only involved in politics and change, but making sure that we are also being as involved as we expect them to be. Because without that, there's a huge gap that won't be filled. So I think that's been the biggest thing, getting them involved and engaged with people who are actually doing the work, which if y'all all know what I'm saying, get them involved with people who are actually doing the work. Performative action will kill everything we're talking about. We're talking about anti-racist community engagement, we talk about politics legislation. Performative action will kill it. Because if you have people who are performative, then they're not actually getting anything done. And the worst thing we could do is bring our young people to a performative politician who's there for a photo op. So that goes down the line for the work that we're doing too.
Yeah, I just shared so from the like class perspective, like absolutely, you know, Cam's coming at them from all directions of like, how do you get involved? How do you think about, being a change agent within the system? In the actual class, from like a preparation standpoint to address what your question is asking, Lily, I know this is Campus Compact and I'm citing Rutledge, but we look at the student companion to community engaged learning and we read chapters from that. But I'm also asking the students to intentionally kind of critically reflect on their positionality. We talk a lot about privilege, especially being a primarily white institution. I practice engaged pedagogy, so I also share my own privilege and I share my critical reflections on being a white woman doing this work or trying to do this work. And so that's part of it. And then the assignment before the podcast, I have them write a community engagement philosophy based on what we've talked about, where they have to identify, kind of like if any of y'all have been on the academic job market and they're asking for DEI statements, like what are the principles that you commit to when you go out to engage in the community? And that's a way for me to kind of make sure that they're on kind of like that they're getting it, that they don't have a charity orientation or a savior orientation to this work. And so that's been a big part of it. And the Ella Baker's catalytic leadership is also great for that. And then I saw that I think Ty had a question in the chat. So logistics. So I look forward to listening to the podcast, but are students on air? Do they have other options, or do they have to engage in the podcast? Do you have different roles for the students to take based on their own strengths, and who does the editing? So, so when we think about podcasts being on air, the reason we talk about them as being edited is that they are they're recorded, but nothing is really live except for like Cam's interview was live. It was recorded live, but then the students gave all of they always give the community partners the option of like, do you want to re-record anything? Do you have questions that you would like to, is there anything else you would like to add? And so there's that kind of element of the being on air. There are specific project roles identified in the group contract, and students have their options that they can pick. Like, do I want to be a researcher or do I want to be a host? And so if you feel like you're more comfortable speaking, then you can take on the like perspective, you can take on being the host role. Or if you feel like you're better at, doing the researching or editing back side of the podcast, then that's on them. I have hands-on training with podcasting during the class so that they gain the skills and how to use Audacity to edit their podcast episodes. And then let's see, so all of the students have to participate in the podcast assignment, and I do require that every single student's voice be heard on the podcast, but I don't say how much they must be heard. So even if it's just to say in the introduction, hi, I'm Brooke Covington, because I have them all introduce themselves, that's fine if they're not somebody that wants to have their voice, heavily featured on the podcast. Yeah, I think, are there like follow-up questions about the logistics or anything?
I think I would just like to be mindful of time, that it's 5 o'clock. Aldo, if you want to, thank you everyone, but Aldo, if you want to wrap us up.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, thank you. That was wonderful. Thank you both, Cam and Brooke, for your wonderful work and your thoughts and inspiration. Thanks for the folks for questions. I just dropped in the chat just real quick for those who want to continue the conversation. We'll be having on March 26th a workshop with lead discussions on developing strategies for intentional anti-racist learning and courses. And then I've also dropped in the chat a list of upcoming sort of workshops and sessions that Campus Compact, we're running through at Campus Compact related to the anti-racist community engaged principles. So included there is the workshop on the 26th, as well as a workshop at Compact 24 for those who will be there in the Pre-Conference Institute, and as well as the next author talk, which will be on Thursday, April the 18th at 3 o'clock. So, all right, well, thank you all very much. And it's great to see everyone. Have a good afternoon.
Thank you. Bye.